Hi there, and welcome to How to Build a Sequence with Personalization and Why Timing Matters. My name is Bec Holland. I'm the Head of Sales Development at Chorus.ai. Before we jump into the content, I wanted to start with this is a response video to the video Personalization at Scale. So if you haven't seen that video, I want you to pause the screen right now, stop what you're doing, go get a drink, use a restroom, and come back and watch Personalization at Scale first. In that video, I unpack how to write an email in a compelling way that really hooks your prospect to want to take a meeting. After I did that video, I got a couple of different responses from people saying, this structure is great and I love how you're writing these emails, but how do I build that into a sales engagement platform to where I make this approach sustainable and make this approach repeatable and have some kind of structure? So this is going to be a response video of how do we do that and how do we make our customers have a really great experience with us in terms of prospecting. Sorry, I'm laughing because I think if you deploy this structure on your prospects, they don't really stand a chance. So to all the prospects out there that are going to get outreach in relation to this video as a result, I'm very deeply sorry. Sorry, not sorry. So without further ado, let's jump into the content. So the sequence is a 16-step sequence within 21 days as a framework. And as a general overview of how to build the sequence, I see a lot of different SDRs. They build the sequence that is more heavy in the beginning and then is lighter on outreach in the end. So I actually took a play out of MJ Hoffman, the author of Why You Now's playbook, and then I make my sequences more aggressive on the back end. In the former case, if you're more aggressive on the front end, if you're more aggressive on the back end, then you give your prospects the impression that in the beginning, you're getting to know them, you're warming up to them, and that at the end, when you're more aggressive, that this person won't go away unless I respond, so it triggers a higher response rate. If you flip that, and the industry norm is to be super aggressive up front and then peter off in the end. The two problems with that approach is, number one, before the prospect really knows who you are in terms of nurture or just in terms of culture and overall feel, you're hammering them with messages so they think you're overly aggressive. And then in the end, you're teaching your prospect, if you peter off your outreach, that if they just wait you out long enough, that you will go away. So as a kind of general rule of thumb, just so you know, I'm a little bit more aggressive on the back end of my sequence, but let's jump into the actual days and steps. So the first step that I take on day one is a LinkedIn profile view. At this point, you've watched the first video. We are looking at our prospect's profile view to make sure that they are still at that company, that they are at a relevant role that we think that could receive some benefit from using our product. And then also we are using that step to tease out 3 different personalized premises of why we think, what about the person made me think that they would use our product and that they would benefit from our product. So again, in that video, I go through the different buckets of the kinds of premises that you can seek out. But what's really important is in that that step 1 on day 1, you are looking at your prospect's profile, you're teasing out 3 different reasons. Maybe it's a webinar that they were a part of like this, or maybe it's an article that they wrote that you think can tie and hook to your value prop. Or maybe they commented on someone's post and you really like the language. But at this point in the game, you're looking for 3 different angles that you would use against your prospect or as a reason for your outreach. And then later in the message, you would tie it back into your value prop and what you do. So step 1 is on day 1 is to go to their LinkedIn profile and figure out what about them makes you think that they could potentially receive benefit from your product. Step 2 is still on day 1, is an initial email. So again, the structure of this email I go into in the Personalization at Scale video, but this is a highly personalized email where in the first step you are giving your reason for outreach, the second step you're going into your value prop, and your third step you are hooking it to your CTA or a call to action of what you want out of that email and result to that email. Day 1 as well. So day 1, you've viewed their LinkedIn profile, you've teased out some premises of what you want to cover in the rest of your sequence. Still on day 1, you're going to send out an initial email that's 100% tailored. And then on day 1 again, if they don't open that email, or if they do open that email, both, you're going to go ahead and you're going to cold call them and try and instigate a conversation based on the premise that you're using in your first email. If none of that works, on the second day, I would go ahead and do another cold call. So the structure of the cold call, if you go to my video on cold calls, you can see a little bit more of what happens in that buyer journey. But what you're really doing here is the first 2 cold calls here are in response to the email that you sent on day 1. So we have day 1, day 1, day 1, and day 2 for a cold call. Then I want you to pause for a little bit. Again, we really want to get to know our prospect. We want to give them the time to breathe. We've made a really impressionable email. We've sent them over something very specific on a psychographic premise towards them. So I want you to play it a little bit cool. Be cool in the beginning of your sequence and let them know that you're there with these touch points, highly personalized and with a lot of respect, but then back off until day 8. Day 8 is follow-up email number 1, and that is going to be step 5 of your sequence. Follow-up email number 1, we're going to have 3 follow-up emails in our sequence here. In the next session, I'm going to cover what the contents of those follow-up emails are. But let's, given that you've seen that video a week from now, just know that the day 8 is going to be follow-up email number 1. By the way, as far as a legend of what is going on here, if there are 3 stars next to a cold call, that means that you left a voicemail. And if there are 2 stars, that means that you are multi-threading the email to the email that you sent before. So in this case, over here for follow-up email number 1, you have 2 stars, which means you were multi-threading that or replying to this first email, this initial email. And cold call number 2, you are leaving a voicemail. The 6th step on day 8 is cold call number 3. So again, we have a follow-up email here that's multi-threaded on day 8. Same day on day 8, we're going to go ahead and give them a cold call. And then we're going to give them a cold call the next day. So I think you're starting to get the pattern here. But every single email that I'm sending to my prospect, I'm giving them 2 cold calls in response. So my sequences over here are actually double as cold call heavy than they are email heavy, because there's nothing like the phone. Especially working in a company like Chorus, there's nothing like the phone. So we have call number 3 and call number 4 in response to this follow-up email that you sent on day 8. So I want you to think of these in terms of almost pods. Here I sent an email and did 2 cold calls. Here's a pod. The second pod is day 8, and day 9. I did these 3 actions. And then we're exponentially going to speed up in terms of how aggressive we are with our prospects. So they should have a good idea here, no matter what channel. They either heard your voicemail, they got your email, they know you're looking at the LinkedIn profile, and they know that you're cold calling them because they heard your voicemail. So we want to speed up and turn up the heat a little bit in terms of the volume of outreach that we're sending to our prospects. Again, full disclosure, in a couple other videos before, I've said this once and I'll say it again. The difference between spam and persistence is that spam has no personalization. So in my experience, my prospects, even when I'm being aggressive with them in terms of the amount of outreach that I'm doing to them, I wouldn't go overboard. But even when the amount is aggressive for them, because I'm so personalized and because the reps over here are so personalized, and even people in the industry who have tried this, the feedback is that their prospects aren't necessarily upset with them because they have a really good reason that they're reaching out. So if you don't get a response here, then on day 13, I would do follow-up email number 2. This is going to be, because there are no stars, this is going to be an initial email. And again, we'll go into the content later. But the third pod 1's here, pod 2 is here, and then the third pod is going to start on day 13. Day 13, I'm going to send the follow-up email number 2. I'm going to transition into a cold call on that same day. And then I'm going to go to the next day, day 14, for cold call number 6. So the third pod starts on day 13. It's a follow-up email number 2 that's not multi-threaded. It's an original email. You have cold call number 5 and cold call number 6. So this is within 2 days of one another, but this is comprehensive of pod number 3. Pod number 4 is going to start on day 18. So I want you to look at the time and space between these different pods. The time and space between day 1 or pod 1 and pod 2 here is 7 days in total, from day 1 all the way to day 8. Between pod 2 and pod 3 is day 8 to really day 13. So we've got 5 days in between there. So it's about half the time that we did for the first one. And then from pod 3 to pod 4, we're going day 14 to day 18. So we got 4 days that we're only waiting in between there. So on day, as a step number 11, on day 18, I send follow-up email number 3. Again, pay attention to the stars here. This is a multi-threaded email to follow-up email number 2. So the content will be in a session next week of what the contents of that email are, but just know that on day 18, you should be sending a follow-up email number 3, which is your last follow-up email, and it should be multi-threaded. On day 18 again, you're going to do 2 cold calls. Day 18, day 19, cold call. So again, the structure is I send an email, I cold call the same day, and then I cold call the next day. So pod 4 is comprehensive of a follow-up email that's multi-threaded and 2 cold calls. And so it's day 18 and day 19. And then the distance between pod 4 and pod 5 is, you guessed it, just 1 day. So pod 5 here is day 20 and day 21 are your 2 cold calls. And then you're going to finalize and end with a breakup email on day 21. So on day 21, you're going to send your final email that's a breakup email. So breakup emails can be really tricky, and I would say stay with me for the session next week on follow-up emails, because I've seen a lot of different breakup emails. Some deployed pretty well, but I have a structure put together that can really get your prospect to respond. The only objection that you can't counter as a rep is the objection that happens the most to reps is your prospect not responding. So day 21, we're going to do 4 cold calls all together. On this day 21, you're going to do a cold call number 10, your final cold call. You're going to leave a voicemail letting them know that you're going to leave them alone. And on day 21, you're going to send this breakup email. I think what's important about this sequence is that when you talk to your prospects and you tell them something, you need to be a man or a woman of your word. So if you tell someone you're going to leave them alone after a breakup email, my opinion is that you should. So this is a very high response rate and trigger rate, but we need to leave our prospects alone for about a month and a half, in my opinion, so that we can hold our word that we're going to leave them alone. So in summary, the steps are allocated here. You have pod number 1, that's day 1 and day 2. It's got 2 cold calls, a LinkedIn view to fuel the entire sequence, and an email. Pod number 2 starts on day 8 and 9. It's an email and 2 cold calls. Pod number 3 starts on day 13. It's a follow-up email and 2 cold calls. Pod number 4, you seeing a rhythm here? Pod number 4 starts on day 18. It's an email and 2 cold calls. And then pod number 5, our final pod, is going to be start with 2 cold calls and end on an email. So that's it, everybody. This is what Josh Braun, industry expert and BD hero, calls the Bec Holland Black Magic Voodoo sequence. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's session, and I hope you're having a great rest of your day.